It was a damp, gray evening in London when the rumors first began to stir. Whispers that somewhere beyond the candlelit taverns and bustling markets, behind the polite smiles of the wealthy, there existed a society so secretive, so cloaked in mystery, that even speaking its name could earn you an uneasy glance. In coffee houses and along the cobblestone streets, people murmured about the Hellfire Club, a gathering of powerful men who met in shadowed halls and country estates to indulge in pleasures and schemes far from the eyes of the public. The stories were never told the same way twice. Some said it was nothing more than a gentleman's club with a taste for theatrics. Others claimed it was a den of moral decay, a place where the most respectable lords became unrecognizable after nightfall. No one seemed to know the full truth. And perhaps that was the point. England in the mid-18th century was a place of contrasts. The age was marked by elegance and refinement, silk waistcoats, powdered wigs, glittering chandeliers, but also by deep inequalities, political rivalries, and a restless curiosity about the limits of human behavior. Beneath the polished manners, there was an undercurrent of rebellion against the strict codes of society. It was a time when public morality and private indulgence often lived uncomfortably side by side. The higher the social rank, the more carefully one had to keep up appearances. Yet, the very men who sat in Parliament by day might slip away under moonlight to seek something entirely different. Among those whispered about most was Sir Francis Dashwood, a man whose charm could win over a crowded drawing room, and whose wit was as quick as his appetite for mischief. Dashwood was no stranger to society's upper crust. He had wealth, influence, and a taste for the eccentric. He also had friends in high places, men who, like him, enjoyed pushing the boundaries of polite society. Together, they began to meet in increasingly elaborate settings, abandoned abbeys, grand estates, and even caves carved into chalk hillsides. What happened in these gatherings was the subject of endless speculation. Some imagined candlelit feasts and toasts that lasted until dawn. Others spoke of symbolic rituals that blended satire, politics, and a mockery of moral pretensions. All agreed on one thing. These meetings were not meant for the eyes or ears of outsiders. But in an England where the church still held immense power, where reputation could be shattered with a single accusation, secrecy was not just preferred, it was essential. That secrecy fed the rumors. Carriage drivers claimed to have dropped off cloaked gentlemen at strange hours. Servants told half-remembered tales of masked guests slipping through side doors. And somewhere in the countryside, hidden from the casual traveler, was said to be the true heart of the Hellfire Club, a place where the members could speak and act without restraint, their identities shielded by a shared oath of silence. Yet not everyone believed the stories. Some insisted it was all exaggerated, a kind of aristocratic joke meant to shock the easily offended. After all, this was the age of satire, when plays and pamphlets poked fun at the rich and powerful. To many, the Hellfire Club was just another scandal invented by those jealous of influence. But to others, the danger felt real. They feared that behind the laughter and masquerade masks lay something darker. Political plotting, moral corruption, perhaps even acts that could change the course of the nation. It was impossible to know for certain, because no one who truly belonged would ever speak openly. For the ordinary Londoner, the club existed somewhere between myth and menace. The name alone, Hellfire, was enough to send shivers down a listener's spine. It spoke to an imagined world where rules dissolved, where power was used for amusement, and where those on the outside could never be sure how far the insiders would go. In a city lit by flickering oil lamps and haunted by both poverty and privilege, it was easy to believe that such a place could exist. As the years passed, the legends grew. There were tales of secret passages beneath country houses, of lavish banquets held in candlelit caverns, of men wearing masks carved into the shapes of beasts and birds. Some swore that these gatherings had a political edge, that behind the laughter and the wine, decisions were made that would ripple through Parliament. Others claimed the members delighted in mocking the church, replacing solemn rituals with absurd imitations. whether true or not. These rumors spread like wildfire among those who longed to imagine what went on behind those locked doors. What makes the Hellfire Club so fascinating is not just what they did, or what people thought they did, but the way they embodied a certain side of 18th century England. The tension between public morality and private indulgence, between the need to belong and the thrill of rebellion. They were products of their time, shaped by an age that prized both reason and pleasure, order and chaos. And in that balance, they found a space where the rules could bend, if only for a night. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. One chilly evening, a young man from London, neither rich nor titled, found himself in the company of someone who claimed to be a member. Over ale and cautious conversation, this mysterious acquaintance painted a picture so vivid it could not easily be dismissed. There was talk of a grand estate in Buckinghamshire, of underground rooms lit only by flickering torches, of voices echoing through stone chambers. The details were too precise to be idle invention. Yet when pressed for proof, the man only smiled and changed the subject. It was a fleeting encounter, but it left behind a question that would not let go. If the Hellfire Club truly existed in the form people imagined, what was their purpose? Was it only about pleasure and defiance? Or was there something more, something hidden beneath layers of secrecy and performance? And if one were to follow those whispers to their source, what might they find waiting in the dark? The truth, as it often is with secret societies, was locked away behind oaths and shadows. But the rumors were enough to lead curious minds down dangerous paths. And somewhere out there, beyond the flicker of street lamps and the clatter of carriage wheels, the next meeting might already be taking shape, waiting for the chosen few to arrive. The winter air of 1755 carried a certain stillness, the kind that settled over the English countryside like a heavy blanket. Away from the crowded lanes of London, the hills rolled in silence, broken only by the distant cry of a night-bird. On such a night, in a stretch of land far from the nearest village, a small procession of carriages wound its way down a narrow, rutted road. The horses' hooves struck the frozen ground with a muted rhythm, and the coach lamps cast weak halos of light that seemed swallowed by the dark. Inside one of those carriages sat a man named Thomas Avery, a minor poet and part-time pamphleteer. He was neither particularly wealthy nor particularly well-connected, but he possessed something rarer, an insatiable curiosity and a knack for listening to the right conversations in the right taverns. Over the past month, he had heard enough snippets of gossip to form a fragile chain of clues, each link leading to the same mysterious destination, the Hellfire Club. Now, by a strange twist of luck, or perhaps by invitation disguised as chance, he was on his way to what he had been told was a gathering of gentlemen with a taste for the unusual. The carriage jolted as it turned off the main road and onto a path flanked by towering hedges. Avery peered out the window, but the world beyond was little more than blackness. His only sense of direction came from the steady forward motion of the horses. He had been told to bring no companion, to speak of this meeting to no one, and to expect a night that would not soon be forgotten. The instructions had been written in a careful hand, sealed with red wax bearing a design he could not place, a sunburst partially hidden behind clouds. At last, the path opened into a broad clearing. There, illuminated by torches driven into the frozen earth, stood a grand country house, its stone facade gleaming faintly in the firelight. The building was older than Avery expected, its Gothic arches and high, narrow windows giving it the air of a place that had seen many lives before this night. Servants in plain, dark livery moved briskly between the arriving carriages, offering a hand to help each guest down. As Avery stepped out, he noticed something peculiar. Nearly all the other men wore masks. Not the feathered or jeweled masks of a masquerade, but simpler designs, smooth, pale faces with expressionless eyes. A few were shaped into subtle animal features, a fox's narrow snout, a hawk's sharp beak. The effect was unsettling. No one greeted him directly, though he felt the weight of several glances as he made his way toward the entrance. Inside, The air was warm and thick with the scent of beeswax and with smoke. A grand hall stretched before him, lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors who seemed to watch the guests with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. A long table stood at the center, laden with silver trays and crystal glasses. Gentle laughter and low voices mingled with the soft strains of a string ensemble playing somewhere just out of sight. A man in a black cloak approached Avery, his mask carved into the form of an owl. "You are among friends here," he said in a smooth voice, guiding him forward. "But remember, the eyes of the world cannot see what we do. You understand this?" Avery nodded, unsure if he truly did. The evening unfolded in fragments, each stranger than the last. At first, it seemed like any high society gathering. Men speaking in small circles, glasses clinking, the occasional burst of laughter. Yet the topics of conversation drifted toward the odd and the irreverent. Satirical toasts were made to the follies of Parliament, followed by mock sermons delivered with perfect seriousness. There was a sense of play acting, but also a sharp edge beneath it, as though the humor carried truths that could not be spoken openly elsewhere. At some point, the guests were invited to descend a narrow staircase at the far end of the hall. Avery followed, the sound of footsteps echoing off cold stone walls. The passage smelled faintly of damp earth, and the torchlight flickered across carved symbols that he did not recognize. Circles intersected by lines, figures holding staffs, stars with too many points. The air grew cooler as they went deeper. The staircase ended in a vast underground chamber. Here, the atmosphere shifted. The walls were lined with niches holding unlit candles, and the ceiling arched high above like the nave of a church. In the center stood a long table surrounded by high-backed chairs, each bearing a small brass plaque. The men took their seats without instruction, as though each knew exactly where he belonged. Dashwood himself was there, recognizable from his portraits, though in person his presence was far more commanding. He wore no mask, only a faint smile as he surveyed the gathering. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stone hall, "tonight we meet not as subjects bound by the dull chains of propriety, but as free minds, unafraid of truth, laughter, and the company of those who will not be shocked." What followed was a strange mixture of formal ritual and irreverent jest. A mock debate was held, complete with exaggerated arguments and theatrical interruptions. A parliament of liberty, someone called it. Toasts were made to historical figures who had defied authority, their names cheered with a fervor that felt almost dangerous. Between speeches, there were moments of silence in which Dashwood seemed to study each man, as though measuring their willingness to go further. Through it all, Avery remained an observer, careful not to reveal too much of his curiosity. Yet he could not shake the feeling that there was another layer to the night, something beneath the laughter and satire. Why meet in a place so hidden? Why insist on mass for some and not for others? And why did the servants, silent and swift, avoid looking anyone in the eye? The evening wore on, and the candles burned lower. At last, Dashwood rose once more. "You have all been given a gift tonight," he said, "and with it, a responsibility. The world above will never understand us, but it will feel our influence." His eyes swept the table. "And if any among us doubts their place here, speak now. For once you pass beyond this hall, there is no return to ignorance." No one spoke. The silence was heavy, almost expectant. Avery felt his pulse quicken. He was certain now that the night's entertainment was only a prelude, that something else was about to begin. Somewhere deep within the stone walls, he thought he heard the faint echo of a door creaking open. And then Dashwood smiled. Not the polite smile of a statesman, but something sharper. "Let us proceed," he said. What happened next will be spoken of only in half-whispers, if it was spoken of at all. The sound that Avery had thought was a door creaking grew clearer as the hall fell into complete silence. It was followed by the unmistakable scrape of stone on stone, and a section of the far wall, seamless just moments before, shifted slowly outward. A cool draft swept into the chamber, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something older, something that felt almost like the air inside a forgotten tomb. The masked men rose from their chairs without a word, moving toward the dark opening in an unbroken line, their footsteps muffled by the worn flagstones. Avery hesitated only a moment before joining them, his curiosity overriding the small voice in his head warning that he had stepped into something far deeper than a night of clever speeches. The passage they entered was narrow, the ceiling low enough that taller men had to stoop slightly. The walls were rough-hewn, their surfaces damp and cold to the touch. Torches fixed at intervals cast unsteady light, revealing occasional carvings, faces, animals, and symbols whose meanings were lost to him. They walked for what felt like several minutes until the path sloped gently downward. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere ahead. Then the passage widened abruptly, spilling them into a cavern that took Avery's breath away. The space was vast, its natural rock formations towering overhead, the walls glittering faintly with mineral deposits. In the center of the cavern was a circular stone platform, and around its edge stood more candles than Avery had ever seen in one place, their flames flickering in unison like 1,000 watchful eyes. Dashwood stepped onto the platform first, his voice carrying easily across the stone. "Here," he said, "is where the masks matter least and the minds matter most." He motioned for the others to join him, and soon the platform was crowded with cloaked figures, their faces still hidden save for the faint glow of candlelight catching their eyes. Avery hung back at the edge, trying to take in every detail. He noticed that the platform was engraved with a circular design, concentric rings filled with more symbols he didn't understand. Some looked like letters from an unfamiliar alphabet, while others resembled constellations. The pattern was worn smooth in places, as though countless feet had crossed it over the years. One of the masked men began to speak, his tone solemn. He recited a passage, part history, part philosophy, about the folly of blind obedience, the virtues of wit and reason, and the need for men of influence to think beyond the limits set by their peers. The words themselves were harmless enough, but the setting made them feel dangerous, as though they carried implications unspoken but understood. When the man finished, Dashwood spoke again. "We gather," he said, "not to offend for offense's sake, nor to defy merely to be contrary, but because truth cannot live in daylight when daylight is ruled by hypocrisy. Here we speak freely. Here we decide what the world above will never admit it needs." It was a strange mixture of idealism and rebellion, and Avery could feel its pull. These men, for all their wealth and privilege, spoke as though they were outlaws, not of the streets, but of thought and influence. It was easy to see how such meetings could shape ideas that rippled far beyond the walls of this hidden chamber. And yet, there was something else. Avery noticed how the servants who had followed them into the cavern stayed well back, their eyes fixed on the ground. He noticed the way certain members exchanged quick glances when Dashwood spoke, as though sharing some private understanding that went beyond the spoken words. And he noticed, too, that there were no windows, no visible exit other than the passage they had come through. After a time, the mood in the cavern shifted. The speeches gave way to laughter again, and the platform became a place of casual conversation. Wine appeared, brought by the silent servants, and small tables were set up along the outer edge of the space. Avery moved among the groups, catching fragments of talk, political strategy spoken in jest, but carrying an edge of sincerity, stories of trips abroad where rules were more easily bent, debates over the power of image versus the power of action. It was then that an older man with a fox-shaped mask approached him. "You're new," the man said, his voice low. "New eyes see what old ones forget to notice." Avery admitted as much, careful not to seem too eager. "Then you should understand something," the man continued. "What happens here is not remembered the way it happens. By the time it reaches the ears of London, it will be a story, not an account. And stories," he paused, as though weighing the words. "Stories have a way of becoming truths, whether or not they deserve to be." Before Avery could ask what he meant, the man drifted away into another conversation, leaving him with a thought that settled uneasily in his mind. Hours passed in that strange, flickering half-light. Eventually, Dashwood signaled for the gathering to end. The men began to leave in small groups, disappearing back into the tunnel. Avery followed the crowd, his legs stiff from standing, his mind turning over the night's events like a puzzle with missing pieces. When they emerged into the main hall of the house, The change in atmosphere was immediate. The warmth and noise of the earlier evening were gone, replaced by a quiet so complete it was almost eerie. One by one, the guests retrieved their cloaks and masks from the servants and departed into the cold night. As Avery stepped back into his carriage, he glanced once more at the great house. Its windows were dark now, the torches extinguished. It looked as still and lifeless as any country estate left empty for the winter. If he hadn't just been inside, he might have believed it was abandoned. The driver urged the horses forward, and the house vanished into the darkness behind them. Avery leaned back, unsure whether he had just witnessed something remarkable or simply been drawn into a performance meant to impress. The air outside was crisp, the stars faint behind a thin veil of cloud. But his thoughts were far from the quiet countryside. Somewhere in that cavern, he felt certain decisions had been made, or at least set in motion, that would find their way into the world above. He could not say what they were, only that the men who made them believed they mattered. And whether the Hellfire Club was truly as scandalous as the rumors claimed, or merely a circle of eccentric minds amusing themselves in secret, one thing was clear. He had only glimpsed the surface of something far more complex. But the most unsettling thought of all came as the carriage neared the outskirts of London. He realized he had never once been told when, or if, he would be invited back. And yet, in his coat pocket, his fingers brushed against the sealed envelope he had been given as he left, its wax unbroken, its weight strangely heavy for such a small thing. Avery turned the envelope over in his hands as the carriage jolted over the uneven road. The seal was the same as before, a sunburst half hidden by clouds, its red wax pressed so deeply that the design caught the faint light seeping through the carriage curtains. It seemed strange to give a guest such a token without explanation, and stranger still to hand it over at the very end of the night, when all farewells had been made. He told himself he could wait until morning to open it. A night's rest might clear his head and let him consider the evening with more reason. But the thought lasted no more than a few minutes. The silence in the carriage, the slow sway of its movement, and the memory of the cavern's cold air made patience impossible. He slipped a finger beneath the wax and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper folded once. The handwriting was the same neat, deliberate script as the first invitation. You have been observed. You will be contacted. No signature, no date, no instruction, just those 7 words. Avery read them again, half expecting the message to change or reveal some hidden meaning on second glance. It did not. He tucked it back into the envelope, but the simple line carried a weight far greater than the paper itself. Observed. The word sent a chill through him. He had been told nothing of what the night's purpose truly was. Yet someone had been watching him closely enough to decide something. The city was still sleeping when the carriage reached his small rooms above a print shop near Fleet Street. The driver gave no farewell, only a brief nod before turning the horses back toward the darkness. Avery climbed the narrow stairs and lit a single candle, setting the envelope on his desk. He thought of writing down everything he had seen, but some instinct held him back. Perhaps it was the memory of Dashwood's gaze sweeping the table, the unspoken warning in that silence. Or perhaps it was the fox-masked man's words about stories becoming truths. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Avery returned to his work, scratching out verses and short satirical pieces for the shop to print, but his mind wandered constantly to that night. He began to notice things he might otherwise have ignored. A carriage parked too long outside the shop, a well-dressed man browsing the pamphlets without buying, the same figure appearing near the coffee house 3 mornings in a row. None of these were proof of anything, but the thought of being observed made even the ordinary seem suspect. One afternoon, while walking along the Strand, he passed a bookseller's stall and spotted a volume he did not recognize. Its cover was plain, but the title caught his eye, Dialogues on Liberty and Reason. Leafing through it, he found certain passages marked with small ink dots in the margin. The marks were subtle, but they stood out once noticed. The first dotted passage read, Freedom is not granted by law, but seized by the mind willing to think beyond it. Another said, the greatest challenge to authority is not rebellion, but laughter. He was still turning pages when the bookseller approached. You've a keen eye, sir, the man said in a tone that was too casual to be casual at all. That book isn't for everyone. Avery asked if it was rare. Not rare, the bookseller replied. Just particular. Those who want to know why. He smiled faintly, as though they were sharing a joke Avery didn't yet understand. Shall I wrap it for you? Against his better judgment, Avery bought the book. The bookseller wrapped it in plain paper and tied it with twine, slipping it into Avery's satchel without another word. That night, in the quiet of his room, Avery read until the candle burned low. The marked passages seemed to form a thread, one idea leading to the next, as if the book contained a conversation meant only for certain readers. Some of the language echoed the speeches he had heard in the cavern, though none of it was direct enough to point to the Hellfire Club by name. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the book was another form of message, a way of testing whether he could follow the thread without being told where it led. Weeks passed. London's winter softened into the damp chill of early spring. Avery half convinced himself that the night at the country house had been a curiosity, nothing more, a peculiar evening with peculiar men. The envelope remained on his desk, unopened since that first night, its message memorized. Life, in its ordinary fashion, began to creep back into place. And then, one rainy afternoon, a boy appeared at the print shop with a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. For you, he said simply, handing it over before darting back into the street. Inside the parcel was another envelope, this time sealed with black wax. The sunburst emblem was gone, replaced by a simple ring, empty at its center. The paper inside carried no greeting, only an address and a time, Friday, 8 o'clock. No instructions, no explanation. Avery knew the street named in the note. It was a quiet lane near the Thames, lined with old warehouses and chandler's shops. But he could think of no reason for a meeting there. And yet, just as before, he felt the pull of curiosity stronger than caution. Friday arrived. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and shining in the gaslight. Avery made his way to the address, his steps echoing on the wet cobblestones. The building was a narrow brick structure, its windows dark, a single lantern hanging above the door. He knocked once. A bolt slid back, and the door opened to reveal a tall man in a plain coat. Without a word, the man stepped aside to let him in. Avery followed him through a short hallway into a small, dimly lit room. There, seated at a simple table, was the fox-masked man from the cavern. The mask was gone now, but Avery recognized the voice immediately. "You came," the man said, as though there had been no doubt. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Good. Then we can begin." The man across from Avery sat with an ease that suggested he was in no hurry, his hands resting lightly on the table. His coat was well cut but plain, and there was nothing in his appearance that would draw attention in a crowd. That, Avery thought, was probably the point. The man poured 2 small glasses of dark wine from a bottle already on the table, sliding one toward him. "You've been wondering what the club wants with you," the man said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "It's a fair question, but before you can understand that, you need to know what the club is, and more importantly, what it is not." Avery took a cautious sip of the wine, saying nothing. The man continued, "You've heard the stories. Every tavern in London has a version. Masked banquets, wild feasts, strange rituals in underground chambers. The truth is, those stories are useful. They keep the curious at a distance. They make us sound like a joke or a scandal, depending on who's telling it. And when something is dismissed as a scandal, it's rarely taken seriously. That's the way we like it." Avery thought back to the cavern, the laughter and speeches, the strange sense of purpose behind the theatrics. "So the stories aren't true?" he asked. "Oh, some are," the man replied with a faint smile. "But they are not the whole truth. The Hellfire Club is not just a gathering of men with a taste for excess. It is a place where ideas can be tested without the interference of Parliament, the Church, or public opinion. Ideas that might be dangerous if spoken aloud in the wrong company." Avery frowned. Dangerous to whom? To those who profit from keeping the world exactly as it is. The man said simply, England is built on rules, some written in law, others unwritten but just as binding. Break the wrong one, and it will not matter if you are in the right. The club is where such rules can be discussed, and sometimes broken, if the cause is worth it. The idea was appealing in theory, but Avery could feel the weight behind the words. And what does this have to do with me? The man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. We need men who can move between worlds. Men who are not tied too tightly to the structures we challenge. You're not an aristocrat, but you know how they speak, how they think. You're not a politician, but you understand the weight of words. You can hear a thing without flinching and repeat it, if needed, in a way that does not betray its source. That makes you valuable. Avery hesitated. And if I refuse? The man's expression did not change, but something in the air between them tightened. Then you will leave here tonight and return to your work as before. But you will always remember that you came close to something few are ever invited to see. And you will never speak of it because you understand, without being told, that some knowledge carries a price. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of rain beginning to patter against the narrow window. Avery could feel the man's eyes on him, waiting for some sign of agreement or rejection. Finally, the man reached into his coat and drew out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. This is an address. In 2 weeks' time, there will be another gathering, not at the country house, but somewhere closer to the city. If you come, you will be given a role to play. If you do not, no one will call on you again. Either choice is final. Avery looked at the paper, but did not touch it. Why me? There must be dozens who could do whatever this is. There are, the man said. But most of them have already chosen sides in battles they don't even understand. You, Mr. Avery, still have the luxury of uncertainty. That is rare, and it will not last. The meeting ended without ceremony. The man stood, adjusted his coat, and led Avery back to the door. Outside, the street was nearly empty, the rain making the cobblestone shine under the weak glow of the lantern. The man gave no farewell, only a slight nod before disappearing back inside. Avery walked the length of the street with the folded paper in his pocket, its weight feeling heavier with each step. He told himself he could throw it into the river, pretend the night had never happened. But deep down he knew he would not. In the days that followed, he found himself looking more closely at the city around him. The narrow lanes and crowded markets seemed unchanged, yet he felt as though some hidden pattern was running beneath the surface. He caught glimpses of familiar faces in unfamiliar places. A gentleman he'd seen at the cavern browsing a bookseller's stall, a servant from the country house, carrying a parcel across Fleet Street. These could have been coincidences, but they felt like something more. One evening, while taking his usual seat at a coffee house, Avery overheard two men at the next table speaking in low voices about a pamphlet that had recently circulated, criticizing a trade policy favored by certain members of Parliament. The men laughed quietly, one remarking, "Our friends in the country will be pleased." Avery thought nothing of it, until one of them pulled from his pocket a silver snuff box engraved with a half-sunburst design. He turned back to his own cup, heart quickening. The mark was not identical to the seal on the Hellfire Club's letters, but close enough to stir the memory. That night, alone in his rooms, he unfolded the paper the man had given him. The address was in Clerkenwell, an area he knew for its mixture of old monastic buildings and newer warehouses. There was no name attached, no sign of what sort of place it might be. The rain outside thickened into a steady downpour, drumming against the window. Avery stared at the paper for a long time before folding it again. He did not yet know what decision he would make, but the fact that the choice weighed so heavily told him that in some way the club had already drawn him in. And if the man was right, that uncertainty could not last. Then the question was not whether he would be part of it, but what it might cost him if he was. Somewhere in the city, preparations were already underway for the next meeting, and Avery suspected that whatever he had seen in the cavern beneath the country house was only the smallest part of what the Hellfire Club truly was. The thought both unsettled and drew him closer. The following morning brought a sky heavy with low clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the rooftops and streets, muting the colors of the town. Thomas rose early, restless from a night of broken sleep. His mind kept circling back to the half-heard whispers and sidelong glances from the night before, the name that had floated between conversations like smoke, Hellfire Club. He didn't quite know why it lodged itself so firmly in his thoughts, but it did, and now he felt drawn to untangle its meaning, even if it was just idle curiosity. He took his breakfast at a small inn near the market square, where the smell of baking bread mingled with damp air drifting in from the open door. The place was quiet except for a few locals, each hunched over their own morning rituals. Thomas tried, without being obvious, to listen to their talk, but the conversation was all about the weather, the price of grain, and the expected arrival of a nobleman's carriage later in the week. Nothing useful. He sighed, wondering if the trail had already gone cold. But just as he was finishing his tea, the innkeeper's wife passed by with a tray and leaned close enough to speak in a low tone. "You'd best be careful asking questions you can't unhear," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. Then she was gone, moving back toward the kitchen, leaving Thomas frozen in his chair. It was a small warning, but one that confirmed he was touching on something that still carried weight, even now. By midday, he wandered through the older quarter of the town, where narrow lanes twisted between ancient timber-framed houses. The stones underfoot were slick from recent rain, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Here, the architecture told a quieter history, one of merchants, craftsmen, and taverns that had seen centuries of whispered deals. Thomas stopped at a small print shop, where the shelves were stacked with pamphlets, sermons, and local announcements. The shopkeeper, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, was friendly enough, though he seemed to measure his words carefully. When Thomas mentioned old societies, the shopkeeper smiled faintly, as though amused. "England's had its share of clubs, sir. Some for sport, some for politics, and some for other amusements." He slid a slim, dusty book across the counter. "You won't find the Hellfire Club named here outright, but you might see its shadow." Thomas leafed through the pages. The writing was cautious, referring to gatherings of distinguished gentlemen who tested the boundaries of polite society and met in places far removed from prying eyes. It was all vague, but the tone carried an undercurrent of something more. Outside, the afternoon light had grown dim, and the first hints of drizzle began to darken the stones. Thomas tucked the book under his coat and kept walking, replaying the phrases in his mind. Places far removed from prying eyes. That matched something he'd heard, a rumor of a cave, carved in the chalk cliffs far from the main roads, where meetings had been held away from watchful townsfolk. He didn't yet know where to find it, but the thought set his pulse quickening. Later, while stopping at a small alehouse for shelter from the rain, Thomas struck up conversation with an older sailor nursing a pint near the hearth. The man had the weathered face of someone who'd seen storms both at sea and on land. When Thomas casually mentioned caves, the sailor grinned, showing a row of uneven teeth. "Ah, there's talk of one down by the river bend, a place folks used to avoid after dark. Said it weren't natural, the way torches burned deep inside when no ship was moored there." The image lodged in Thomas's mind, an entrance glowing faintly in the distance, with no sign of life around it. He wondered if such a place still existed, or if time and tide had erased it. The sailor wouldn't say more, claiming it was just an old tale, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of someone holding back. By evening, Thomas found himself back in his small rented room, staring at the book he'd borrowed. Candlelight danced across the pages as the wind rattled the shutters. The words seemed to pull him in, describing the allure of exclusive circles where men of power could speak freely, trade influence, and indulge in ideas too bold for the drawing rooms of London. These gatherings, the book implied, were often shrouded in rituals, some invented for spectacle, others echoing older traditions whose meanings had been lost or deliberately hidden. He read until the candle guttered low, and when he finally looked up, the room felt colder, as if some presence had crept in with the wind. He told himself it was nonsense, but he could not shake the thought that once a person started down this path of curiosity, it was difficult to turn back. Somewhere out there were the remnants of a group that had once met in shadows and silence, and it seemed their story was not entirely finished. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was broken by strange dreams, flickering torchlight in underground chambers, masked figures in velvet coats, the low murmur of voices speaking in half-remembered Latin. In the dream, someone turned toward him, their face hidden, and whispered something he could not quite catch. He awoke with his heart pounding, unsure if he wanted to remember what was said. In the gray stillness before dawn, Thomas sat by the window and watched the empty street below. Somewhere in this town, and perhaps farther beyond, pieces of the puzzle waited for him. And yet, he felt a quiet warning pressing at the edges of his thoughts. Some doors, once opened, were not so easily closed. The tension in the air seemed to follow them long after they had left the street. The city was quieter now, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that made every small sound stand out. Their footsteps echoed faintly against the walls, each one a reminder that the night was far from over. The wind pushed scraps of paper along the pavement, rustling them in sharp, sudden bursts, almost as if the city itself was trying to whisper warnings they couldn't quite make out. Marcus walked a few steps ahead, glancing over his shoulder now and then, his eyes sharp and searching. He wasn't just being cautious, he was calculating. Every corner, every shadow, every open doorway was measured for risk. Behind him, Lena kept her pace steady, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The look in her eyes told its own story, one of unease and unanswered questions. She didn't fully trust Marcus yet, but for now, he was the only one guiding her through a city she no longer recognized. It was strange how fast familiar places could change. The cafe where she used to read in the afternoons now had its windows boarded up. The small bookstore across the street was gone, replaced by a nameless office with drawn blinds. Even the street lights seemed dimmer than she remembered, as if the whole neighborhood had decided to fade into the background. And yet, something about the way Marcus moved made her think he still knew these streets better than anyone. They turned down an alley, and Marcus slowed his pace, lowering his voice. "There's someone you need to meet," he said, not looking at her. "Someone who can give you answers I can't." The way he said it made her skin prickle. It wasn't just that he was keeping things from her. It was that he sounded as if speaking too much might invite danger they weren't ready to face. Halfway down the alley, they came to an unmarked door. Marcus knocked 3 times in a slow rhythm, then twice quickly. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the faint sound of a latch sliding back broke the silence, and the door creaked open. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by a single bulb that swayed slightly, as if moved by a draft. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Lena's footsteps seemed too loud against the floorboards, so she tried to step lightly. Marcus led her through 2 more doors, each locked and then carefully closed behind them, until they reached a small room where a man sat at a desk. His face was lined, his hair silver, and his eyes sharp enough to make Lena feel like he could see straight through her. "This is Daniel," Marcus said simply. "He knows things most people wish they didn't." Daniel didn't speak right away. He studied her for a long moment before finally leaning back in his chair. "You've been asking the wrong questions," he said in a voice that was calm, but carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "That's why you haven't been getting any answers." Lena frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel glanced at Marcus before speaking again. "You've been trying to figure out what happened, but you should be asking why it happened." The words settled heavily between them. Marcus didn't interrupt, but Lena caught the slight tightening of his jaw. There was more here, more than either of them was ready to admit. Daniel stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down a small, battered notebook. He sat on the desk and pushed it toward her. "This is what's left of the story," he said, "but not the whole thing. The rest is still out there." Lena opened the notebook slowly, feeling the uneven texture of the worn cover under her fingertips. Inside were pages filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams, and fragments of newspaper clippings glued in at odd angles. Some of the ink had faded, but enough remained for her to see that it was no ordinary collection of notes. This was a record, someone's careful attempt to piece together events that had been hidden, rewritten, or erased entirely. She looked up at Daniel. her voice low. "Who wrote this?" Daniel gave a faint, almost tired smile. Someone who didn't live long enough to finish it. The room seemed colder after that. Lena closed the notebook and glanced at Marcus, who avoided her gaze. There was something in his silence that told her he already knew parts of this story, and that he had been hoping to avoid this moment. Daniel walked back to his desk and sat down again, his expression unreadable. "You have to decide if you really want to keep going," he said. "Once you step into this, there's no stepping back. People disappear when they get too close. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's slow, but it's always the same in the end." The way he said it made Lena's chest tighten. She had already seen enough to know that danger was real, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it harder to ignore. Marcus finally spoke, his tone low and steady. "We've already started. There's no stopping now." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Then you need to be careful who you trust. The line between ally and enemy isn't where you think it is." Lena wanted to ask what that meant, but something in Daniel's eyes told her that the answer wouldn't come easily. Instead, she slipped the notebook into her bag, feeling its weight as though it carried more than just paper. When they left the building, the air outside felt heavier, as if the city had been holding its breath while they were inside. The street was still empty, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from somewhere she couldn't see. Marcus didn't speak as they walked, but his pace was faster now, his attention sharper, his gaze flicking toward every shadow. They reached an intersection where the street lights buzzed faintly, the glow pooling weakly on the cracked asphalt. Marcus paused there, looking down both directions before choosing the left. "We need to stay ahead of this," he said quietly, almost to himself. Lena glanced at him. Ahead of what? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "Ahead of whoever already knows we're looking." The words sent a chill through her. The night seemed even darker now, the silence between them filled with the sound of their own footsteps and the knowledge that somewhere, someone was already one step closer. Rain had started to fall again, thin and cold, soaking into the narrow alleys and slick cobblestones. Every sound felt sharper. Footsteps echoing, water dripping from broken gutters, the distant rumble of a car engine somewhere it didn't belong. The air carried a tension that made people walk faster, keep their heads down, and avoid eye contact. It wasn't just the weather. It was the sense that something was about to break. Marco knew the city well enough to read its mood. He'd grown up here, learned its shortcuts, its shadows, and the quiet signs that trouble was near. Tonight, those signs were everywhere. A black sedan had been parked on the corner too long. A man in a brown coat had lit 3 cigarettes without taking more than 2 drags each, eyes fixed on the street. Conversations stopped the moment he passed. The tension was more than bad weather. It was the scent of a storm that had nothing to do with the clouds overhead. Inside the old cafe, the lights were low, and the smell of strong coffee clung to the air. Marco sat in the back, waiting. His fingers tapped against the wooden table, a habit he'd never been able to break when he was restless. Across from him, Elena kept her eyes on the door, her lips pressed tight. She had a way of sensing danger before it showed itself. And tonight, she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "They're moving faster than we thought," she whispered, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the espresso machine. "Whatever happened last night, it's changed everything." Marco didn't ask for details yet. He wanted her to get to it in her own time. Pushing her never worked. She only spoke when she decided the moment was safe enough. "They're looking for someone," she finally said. "And I think they believe you know where he is." The name wasn't spoken, but Marco already knew. The man she was talking about wasn't someone you wanted to be connected to, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd seen. If half the rumors were true, he had information that could shake loose the quiet alliances, keeping the city's peace balanced on a knife's edge. "I don't," Marco said, not lying, but not entirely telling the truth either. He'd seen the man once, 3 nights ago, slipping through a side street, as if he were part of the fog. That brief glance had been enough for him to understand. This wasn't just another player in the city's underworld. This was someone who didn't want to be found for reasons that went beyond personal survival. Elena leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. There's more. 2 people are already missing. And it's not just them. They're wiping traces. Phones, addresses, records. Like they never existed. The thought chilled him more than the rain outside. Disappearances happened, sure, but erasing someone completely, that was deliberate, organized. A waiter came by, placing another cup of coffee on the table without looking at either of them. His hand shook slightly before he walked away. Marco noticed. The fear wasn't isolated, it was spreading. Outside, a shadow moved past the window, pausing just long enough to glance inside. Elena stiffened, her fingers curling around the edge of her seat. Marco didn't react, not outwardly, but he shifted his position so he could watch the reflection in the glass. The figure lingered a moment too long, then kept walking. "They're not going to stop," Elena said. "And if you're caught in this, they won't care which side you're on." The problem was, Marco wasn't sure there were sides anymore. Whatever this was had reached a point where old alliances and rivalries blurred. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, wondering if the person they'd trusted yesterday might sell them out tomorrow. Later, walking through the rain-soaked streets, Marco kept replaying her words in his mind. He passed shuttered shop fronts, graffiti-stained walls, and the occasional faint glow of a window where someone stayed up too late, hoping the world outside would leave them alone. He thought about the man they were all hunting, about the missing people, about the way the city felt like it was holding its breath. He knew he'd have to dig deeper, but that meant pulling on threads that could unravel more than he could control. And the deeper he went, the more he risked drawing attention he couldn't shake. The danger wasn't in what he knew now. It was in what he might learn if he kept going. From somewhere in the distance, a sharp sound cracked through the night. It wasn't thunder. Marco stopped, listening, every instinct telling him the city's storm had already started. The air inside the small, dimly lit room seemed heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the tension. Every conversation in the neighborhood, lately, seemed to circle back to the same question. What exactly had happened the night everything went wrong? People spoke in fragments, in whispers over coffee, or in hurried exchanges on street corners, but no one had the full picture. It was as if a shadow had crept into the lives of everyone connected, and nobody wanted to admit how deep it had reached. Lena found herself walking those same streets more often now, her mind looping through memories she didn't trust anymore. She would glance at familiar faces and wonder if they knew more than they were letting on. Sometimes she caught herself staring too long at a passing car, wondering if the person inside was watching her back. Even at home, she felt a restlessness that kept her pacing, listening for any sound out of place. Across town, Daniel was facing his own struggle. He kept replaying the last conversation he had with Marco before things escalated. Marco's words had been sharp, but also strangely calm, as if he had already accepted something Daniel didn't yet understand. Since then, Daniel had been torn between loyalty and fear, unsure whether to protect his friend or protect himself from being pulled into something he couldn't escape. He had started noticing the same cars following him too, sometimes 3 nights in a row. At first, he told himself it was just coincidence, but now he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, rumors about the incident were starting to branch into strange directions. Some people claimed it was about money. Others insisted it was about old grudges that had been buried for years. There were whispers of deals gone wrong, documents hidden away, and names that couldn't be spoken too loudly. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle without knowing if the picture was even real. The deeper the uncertainty grew, the more isolated everyone seemed to become. Conversations ended mid-sentence when certain topics came up. Neighbors who used to share meals avoided each other's eyes. And yet, the feeling that something larger was moving beneath the surface kept pulling people's attention back to the heart of the conflict. One rainy evening, Lena went to meet someone who had reached out anonymously. The message had been simple. "I know what you're looking for. Come alone." She had almost ignored it, but curiosity outweighed caution. The cafe was quiet when she arrived, the only sound being the slow hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain. A man sat in the far corner, his face partially shadowed. "You're asking the wrong people the right questions," he said without introduction. His voice was low, steady, and that's dangerous. Lena leaned forward, keeping her tone calm. Then who should I be asking? The man shook his head. Not who. Where? There are places people go when they want things forgotten. You'll find more there than from anyone willing to talk to your face. Before she could press further, he stood up, left a small folded paper on the table, and walked out. When Lena opened it, she saw nothing but an address and a single time written in hurried handwriting. No name, no explanation. Elsewhere, Daniel had been drawn into a separate thread of the same tangled mess. An old contact had called him, claiming to have something that could shift the entire balance of the conflict. The problem was the meeting spot was deep inside a part of the city Daniel had always avoided, the kind of place where silence was currency and eyes followed strangers until they were gone. As the night unfolded, both Lena and Daniel found themselves moving toward answers they weren't sure they wanted. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker. Somewhere in the background of it all, unseen forces were tightening their grip, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. And although neither of them could see the full picture yet, the lines between their paths were beginning to blur, pulling them both closer to the core of a truth that might be too dangerous to uncover. The air in the small coastal town felt heavier that morning, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. People walked slower, eyes darting toward the harbor where rumors had begun to take shape. Nobody said anything outright, but everyone seemed to know something was coming. At the center of it all, the people involved were carrying their own quiet storms, each one tangled in the other's path without fully realizing it yet. Amir stood on the worn wooden pier, staring at the water that lapped gently against the posts. He had been part of the community his whole life, and yet lately, he felt like a stranger here. His father's old fishing boat bobbed nearby, the paint peeling, nets bundled in the corner. That boat had carried food to the family table for decades, but now it was tied up and used. Business had slowed, and something else, something unseen, was keeping the fishermen out of certain waters. Behind him, voices drifted from the nearby market. People were talking in low tones, some glancing toward the pier, others pretending not to notice him at all. That was the thing about small towns. Secrets rarely stayed buried, but they could sit under the surface for years, quietly shaping everything around them. Layla, who ran the small bakery near the church, wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. She had heard bits and pieces, strange cargo being moved at night, men with unfamiliar faces in the tavern, and an argument that had broken out behind the harbor warehouses a few days ago. She didn't want to believe Amir was caught up in any of it, but she couldn't ignore what people were saying. Meanwhile, at the far edge of town, Detective Rafiq sat in his dimly lit office, sifting through reports that didn't quite add up. Officially, his task was to investigate a string of missing shipments that had passed through the docks. Unofficially, he was trying to map out something much bigger, a web of transactions and movements that seemed to link the fishing boats, certain shop owners, and a set of records that had gone missing from the town archives. Every time he thought he had a lead, it dissolved like mist. The main conflict was beginning to take shape, but not in a way that anyone could fully see yet. Each person had only their piece of the puzzle, and no one was sharing. Amir knew something about the missing shipments, but it wasn't what people assumed. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, twice, and each time he had overheard things he wasn't meant to hear. Now, certain people were watching him a little too closely. Layla's subplot began quietly. She noticed one of her suppliers had stopped delivering flour, claiming shortages. But late at night, she saw the same delivery truck parked by the old canning factory, long abandoned except for the flicker of light that sometimes escaped through the cracks in its doors. She didn't tell anyone, but the image stuck in her mind, feeding her unease. Rafiq's perspective added another layer. The missing shipments were just part of it. He was beginning to suspect that someone inside the town council knew more than they were letting on. The council records he requested had been misplaced, and when he visited the storage room where they should have been, the lock was new. It wasn't just about goods being moved illegally. It was about certain people keeping their positions safe while letting the rest of the town suffer. All of this built a tension that felt both invisible and unavoidable. The fishermen avoided certain waters not because of storms or bad catches, but because boats that went there sometimes came back damaged or didn't come back at all. Shopkeepers were raising prices quietly, saying their costs had gone up, but the real reason was whispered in hallways and alleyways. Someone was taking a cut from every shipment, legal or not. The town's old rhythms were breaking apart. The harbor no longer smelled just of salt and fish. It carried the faint, metallic tang of something else, something no one wanted to name. Strangers had started renting rooms above the tavern, keeping odd hours, speaking in low tones to certain locals who suddenly had more money than they used to. Amir, caught between staying quiet and speaking up, found himself thinking about his father's old stories, tales about how this town once pulled together in hard times. But that was before deals were made behind closed doors, before loyalty could be bought, and before fear crept into everyday conversations. Layla tried to push the unease aside, focusing on her bakery, but each day brought another small sign that something was wrong. A regular customer who stopped coming in, a friend who avoided her gaze, and that truck by the canning factory appearing again in the early hours of the morning. Rafik's notes were filling up faster than he could make sense of them. Patterns emerged, then slipped away, replaced by new leads that seemed just as fragile. He began to think that if he could connect Amir, the missing shipments, and whatever was happening at the canning factory, he might finally understand the real scope of what was going on. But no one was ready to put all the pieces together yet. Everyone was protecting something, whether it was their family, their business, or simply their own sense of safety. The tension wasn't just in the air. It was in the way people paused mid-sentence, in the way doors were locked a little earlier each night, and in the way the sea seemed to watch the town silently, as if it knew what was coming before they did. And while the days passed with that same low hum of unease, small choices were being made, quietly, in kitchens and back rooms, and on the pier, that would decide how the conflict would play out when it finally broke into the open. The night air felt heavier than usual, carrying the kind of quiet that made every distant sound sharper. Inside the dimly lit apartment, Elena sat by the window, her fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee she'd barely touched. Across the street, the old factory stood like a shadow against the skyline, its broken windows catching the faint glow of passing headlights. She'd been watching that building for weeks now, ever since she found the strange note slipped under her door. It had only 3 words: "They know everything." No signature, no explanation, just that chilling warning. Meanwhile, Marcus paced in the narrow hallway outside, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in a low voice, but Elena could still hear the tension in every word. He wasn't a man who scared easily, yet something about this case had carved a deeper worry into his face. When he finally stepped back in, he avoided her gaze, setting his phone down on the table. "They're moving faster than we thought," he muttered, pulling out a chair, but not sitting. Elena finally set her coffee aside. "Who's moving faster?" she asked, but the question came out softer than intended. She already knew the answer, at least part of it. "Everyone," Marcus replied. "The people watching you, the ones who left the note, maybe even people we haven't seen yet." He rubbed the back of his neck like he was trying to work out a knot. "And if we're not careful, they'll make the first move before we can even figure out the game." For a while, they said nothing. The sound of a siren wailed faintly in the distance, fading as quickly as it came. Marcus finally sat, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "Tell me again about the night you think it all started." Elena hesitated, but the memory had been living just under her skin for so long it came spilling out. "It was late. I've been walking home from work, same as always. But I felt it, someone behind me, matching my steps. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I heard the car. Black, no plates. It slowed when I crossed the street, then turned off the moment I got near the alley. I didn't see the driver's face, but she trailed off, shaking her head. That's the night the note appeared." Marcus tapped the table lightly, thinking, "And you've never told anyone else about this? Not even your brother?" Her eyes flickered briefly. "Especially not my brother." There it was again, that unspoken history between her and her family that Marcus had been trying to untangle. He didn't push, but he stored it away like another puzzle piece. Outside, the faint hum of a passing truck filled the silence. But Elena's thoughts were still stuck on the factory. She couldn't explain why, but something about it pulled at her, like an answer waiting inside. She'd seen shadows moving there some nights, though no one should have been in that abandoned place. Marcus followed her gaze. "If you're thinking of going in there, you're not doing it alone," he said flatly. "I wasn't planning to," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. What neither of them noticed was that across the street, in the upper window of the factory, a faint light flickered once, then vanished. By the next morning, the city felt different. The streets were busier, but not in the usual way. People seemed on edge, their conversations quieter, their glances sharper. Marcus had arranged a meeting with an old contact, a man named Jonah, who owed him more than a few favors. Jonah had a reputation for knowing things before they made the papers, and he'd agreed to meet at a small diner near the river. When they arrived, Jonah was already there, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. His eyes darted to the door the moment they walked in, then back to the corner as if making sure no one else was listening. "You're asking the wrong questions," Jonah said without preamble. "It's not about who's following her. It's about what she's holding on to without knowing it." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm not. Not intentionally," Jonah interrupted. "But you've been in the wrong place at the wrong time more than once lately. And there are people who think you saw something you shouldn't have." Marcus leaned forward. "Like what?" Jonah shook his head. "That's the problem. You'll know when they decide you've had enough time to remember." Before they could press further, Jonah's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face paled. Without another word, he slid out of the booth, tossed a few bills on the table, and left through the back door. Elena stared after him. What was that about? Marcus didn't answer. He was watching the reflection in the diner's glass window, a dark sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted too heavily for daylight. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She sat on her couch, the city's faint glow seeping through the blinds, replaying Jonah's words over and over. If she really had seen something without realizing it, what could it be? And why did it feel like the answer was closer than anyone wanted to admit? She thought about calling Marcus, but something told her he was already working, maybe even watching the same building she couldn't stop thinking about. When the first faint light of morning slipped across the floor, Elena finally stood. Her coffee machine clicked on automatically, filling the room with its warm scent. She stared out the window again, across at the factory, and for the first time she saw it in the daylight. Its walls cracked, its windows jagged, but still standing as though it was keeping secrets no one had yet dared to uncover. And somewhere inside, she knew the next move had already been made. The air felt heavier than before, as if every breath carried the weight of something no one dared to say aloud. The city streets were quieter now, but it wasn't the calm of peace. It was the quiet before storm. The meeting place was chosen carefully, far from curious eyes, yet close enough to the heart of the conflict to feel its pulse. Every shadow seemed to watch, every gust of wind whispered warnings. People moved with purpose, their expressions guarded, their eyes darting to every corner. Trust had become a rare currency, and no one was spending it easily. Inside a dim, narrow room above an old shop, a small group sat around a battered wooden table. Maps were spread out, some marked in hurried red strokes, others filled with notes written in a hand that had clearly trembled. The tension between them was unspoken but undeniable. They all knew what was at stake, but each had their own reasons for being here, and those reasons didn't always align. Some wanted justice, others wanted revenge, and a few were just trying to survive. The leader of the group leaned forward, his voice low and steady, yet carrying a weight that silenced the rest. "If we move too soon, we'll lose everything. If we wait too long, they'll crush us before we can even act." His words hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. A young woman sitting across from him shook her head. "Waiting is what's killing us. Every day, they get stronger. Every day, more people disappear." Her voice cracked slightly, revealing the strain she had been hiding. From the corner, a quiet figure spoke for the first time, his tone calm, but edged with something darker. "It's not just about strength. They know our patterns. Someone's been feeding them information. That accusation sent a chill through the room. Everyone's eyes shifted, scanning faces for the slightest hint of guilt. No one spoke, but the silence itself was louder than words. The idea of a traitor among them was more dangerous than any enemy outside. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the opposition was making their own moves. A polished office, far removed from the cold streets, was filled with the soft hum of expensive machinery and the smell of fresh coffee. Behind a sleek desk, a man reviewed reports with a calculated patience. Every line of data, every photo, every recorded conversation, he consumed it all like a chess player studying the board before a decisive move. His power came not from brute force, but from knowing exactly where and when to apply pressure. And he already knew where his next strike would be. Back in the dim room, the maps and plans were swept aside as arguments grew more heated. Old wounds resurfaced. Past mistakes were thrown like weapons, and the fragile sense of unity began to fray. It was in this chaos that the quiet figure spoke again, offering a plan so risky it bordered on madness. We hit them where they think they're untouchable. No warnings, no delays. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing on everyone. The young woman looked at him with a mix of fear and resolve. If we do that, there's no turning back. His answer came without hesitation. We passed the point of no return a long time ago. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly on the roof like a distant drumbeat. It was the kind of rain that could hide footsteps, blur outlines, and wash away the traces of what was about to happen. Somewhere in the darkness, other players in this tangled game were making their own preparations, each believing they had the upper hand. But the truth was, no one really did. Every choice now carried the risk of total collapse. And as the night deepened, the lines between loyalty and betrayal, courage and recklessness began to blur beyond recognition. Every movement, every whispered word brought them closer to the breaking point, the moment when everything they had been building toward would either explode into victory or shatter into ruin. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first spark to ignite the final confrontation. The night air felt heavier than ever, pressing down on the city like an invisible weight. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching long across the wet pavement as the distant hum of traffic faded into an uneasy silence. Inside the old building, where everything was coming to a head, the walls seemed to close in, holding the secrets of too many people who had crossed lines they could never uncross. Every sound echoed, the faint creak of the floorboards, the slow drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the dark, and it made even the most seasoned among them glance over their shoulders. Tomas stood near the cracked window, watching the narrow alley below. His breath fogged the glass, but he didn't move to wipe it away. He was listening for something, anything, a signal, a footstep, a whisper. His mind kept running over the last conversation he'd had with Elena. She had told him there were things he didn't understand yet, pieces of the puzzle that were deliberately kept from him. But now, with so much closing in, Tomas wasn't sure if he had time to understand them before it was too late. In the back of the room, Marcus was quietly loading gear into a battered duffel bag. He didn't say a word, but the way his jaw was set told everyone that he was expecting things to go bad and fast. Each click of the magazine, sliding into place, felt like a countdown. He had seen what desperation could do to people, how alliances broke apart, how people who once sat at the same table could turn into enemies overnight. Meanwhile, Elena was across town, moving through dimly lit streets toward the old warehouse district. She knew this was the point of no return. The information she carried wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of truth that would split everything wide open if it ever came out. But the closer she got, the more she wondered if she was being followed. More than once, she caught a shadow moving just a little too quickly behind her, vanishing when she turned. Her instincts screamed at her to be careful, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Back at the building, Tomas finally turned away from the window. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of everything they were facing. Marcus looked up, but didn't answer. The tension between them wasn't new. It had been there for weeks, but tonight it was sharper. They both knew that what was coming wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing who they were willing to stand beside when everything fell apart. Down in the street, a car slowed as it passed. The sound of its tires hissing over wet asphalt sent a ripple of unease through the room. Tomas's eyes narrowed. "That's the third time it's circled the block," he murmured. Marcus moved to the wall, staying out of sight as he peered through a narrow gap in the curtains. The car idled for a moment, then drove on, but neither of them believed it was gone for good. Across the river, in a small, dimly lit office above a shuttered cafe, a man in a dark coat sat at a desk covered in papers. He was listening to a recording, the faint hiss of static barely hiding the voices beneath. Every so often, he'd pause, rewind, and listen again. The conversation he was analyzing was one that could connect the dots between every player in this dangerous game, but only if he could keep it out of the wrong hands long enough to act. By the time Elena reached the warehouse district, the streets were almost empty. She could see the faint glow of a light inside one of the buildings, just where she'd been told to go. Her heart pounded harder with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just beyond her sight, tracking her. She reached the door, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pushed it open. The hinges groaned, and the stale air inside carried a scent of dust and something faintly metallic. Inside, the shadows felt thicker. She could barely make out the figure standing in the center of the room, waiting for her. "You made it," the voice said softly, but there was no warmth in it. She stepped closer, her eyes adjusting slowly. The figure moved into the light, and for a moment, all the unease in her chest solidified into something sharper. This was not who she expected to see. Back in the building, Tomas and Marcus both froze as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. They exchanged a glance, no words needed, and moved silently into position. The doorknob rattled once, then stopped. The footsteps moved on, fading into the distance, but the damage was done. Every nerve in their bodies was on edge now. In another part of the city, a storm was rolling in. The low rumble of thunder seemed to follow every movement, as if the sky itself knew something was about to happen. People on the street moved faster, trying to get home before the rain came. But for the ones at the center of this dangerous web, there would be no safe place to hide when the first drops began to fall. The hours stretched, each one feeling like it could be the last before everything exploded. And as the pieces moved into place, unseen hands pulling strings, whispered deals being made in dark corners, everyone felt the same unshakable truth. The moment of impact was coming, and there would be no turning back once it hit. The cold wind rattled the broken window, sending shivers through the room as everyone stared at each other in tense silence. Every sound outside seemed sharper now. The distant hum of a car engine, the metallic creak of a loose sign swaying in a breeze, the faint drip of water somewhere in the corner. It felt as though the entire city had gone quiet just to hear what would happen next. Marco's jaw was tight, his eyes darting between the others, reading every flicker of doubt, every twitch of impatience. The air was thick with mistrust. Everyone knew they were too deep in this to turn back, but no one wanted to say it aloud. Isabella sat by the door, her fingers curled around the armrest of the chair, eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. She had been calm earlier, but now her breathing was faster, more shallow, as though she could already sense the trouble creeping closer. In the corner, Luca kept tapping his fingers against the table, his usual confidence replaced by a restless energy. "It's not adding up," he muttered, almost to himself. "We've been careful, too careful, for this kind of heat to find us so fast." His voice was low, but it carried a sharp edge, and everyone heard the suspicion buried inside it. Across the room, Enzo shifted uncomfortably. His hands were hidden in the pockets of his coat, but Marco noticed the subtle movement, his thumb rubbing over something small and metallic. Marco didn't say anything, but his mind filed it away. In a situation like this, every detail mattered. One wrong move could shatter whatever fragile trust they had left. From somewhere outside came the faint crackle of a radio. It was far away, but enough to make everyone freeze for a moment. The tension tightened like a wire, and no one moved until the sound faded into the wind again. Marco finally stood, pacing the room slowly, his shoes scuffing against the worn floor. "We don't have the luxury of guessing anymore," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If someone's feeding them information, we find out tonight. No delays." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. Isabella glanced at Luca, then at Enzo, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but her silence said enough. She was watching too, and she didn't trust anyone completely. As the hours dragged on, the city outside seemed to grow darker, as if even the streetlights knew to dim themselves before what was coming. Every person in that room was thinking the same thing, though no one dared to speak it aloud. The real danger wasn't out there. It was in here, breathing the same air, sitting at the same table. And somewhere, hidden just out of reach, was the one piece of truth that would change everything. It was close, too close, and Marco could feel it pressing against the edges of his patience, waiting for the moment to break loose. The air inside the old warehouse felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Shadows shifted across the cracked concrete floor, stretching long under the dim overhead light. Every creak of the metal beams echoed, making each person inside glance over their shoulder. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was in their bones. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, but no one could quite name it yet. The main players stood in a rough circle, their eyes darting between one another, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then came the sound, a faint thud from somewhere above, almost too soft to notice. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual groan of the building. It was deliberate. Someone else was here. That's when the real unease began to ripple through the group. The leader's jaw tightened, scanning the rafters, and for a brief second, everyone forgot their own grievances. The enemy they thought they knew might not be the only one in play tonight. A slow smile crept across the face of the quietest man in the room, the one who had barely spoken all night. His eyes glinted in the low light as he shifted his stance. "Funny," he said in a low, measured tone, "how everyone came here thinking they knew the plan." His voice was calm, but there was something in it that made even the most hardened among them straighten. He reached into his jacket and slid something across the floor, a small, battered notebook. The pages were worn, the edges smudged with fingerprints. The leader bent to pick it up, flipping through the pages quickly. His expression darkened with each turn. It wasn't just notes. It was a ledger. Every meeting, every payment, every move they had made for months, documented in meticulous detail. And at the bottom of each page, there was a signature none of them recognized. Someone had been keeping track, not for their own records, but for someone else entirely. The room erupted in voices, accusations, demands, confusion. But the quiet man didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, letting the chaos feed itself, until he finally spoke again. "You've all been looking in the wrong direction. The one you think is pulling the strings? They're nothing compared to who's really watching." It was a statement heavy with implication. The leader's grip tightened on the ledger. There had been rumors before, whispers of someone operating far above the known hierarchy, but no one had dared to believe it. Now, faced with the undeniable proof in his hands, the leader's confidence began to fray. A loud crash shattered the moment, glass exploding inward from the far window, sending shards across the floor. Figures in black moved fast through the shadows, their steps silent, their faces hidden. It was impossible to tell who they were with, or if they were with anyone at all. In an instant, the warehouse was no longer a meeting ground. It was a trap. The group scattered, ducking behind crates and pillars, trying to find cover. The smell of dust and old oil filled the air as footsteps pounded across the floor. The quiet man didn't move to hide. Instead, he walked toward the chaos, his eyes locked on the newcomers. "They're early," he murmured under his breath, almost as if to himself. But those close enough to hear knew this wasn't random. He had known they were coming. The question was, had he called them here? Or had they been tracking him too? One of the masked intruders stopped, locking eyes with the quiet man. Even through the layers of shadow and fabric, there was recognition in the stillness between them. The rest of the room seemed to blur as they stared each other down. Without a word, the intruder reached into their vest and pulled out something small, tossing it at the quiet man's feet before disappearing back into the fray. It was a folded photograph, yellowed at the edges, creased from years of being carried. The quiet man knelt, picking it up. As he unfolded it, his expression changed. Not fear, not anger, but something colder. The picture showed a group of people, years younger, standing together outside a building. Some faces were familiar, men and women still in the room now. But there was one figure at the center that none of the others had seen before, and it was circled in red ink. The leader caught sight of it and froze. "Who is that?" he demanded. The quiet man didn't answer. Instead, he slipped the photograph into his pocket, his gaze drifting upward toward the rafters where the first sound had come from. The real threat wasn't the people rushing in through the windows. It was whoever was up there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The noise in the warehouse grew louder, the air hotter with tension. This wasn't just a raid. It was a message. And the more the leader looked at the quiet man, the more he realized that message might not be for him at all. The air inside the safe house felt heavier than it had earlier in the night. Even the faint ticking of the old wall clock seemed too loud, like it was mocking the silence between them. Marco paced near the window, peeking through the blinds every few seconds, his shoulders tense. Elena sat on the couch, still clutching the folded piece of paper they had found in the abandoned apartment, the one with only 4 words written on it. Words that could either be a warning or an invitation. "We can't just sit here," Marco muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. "Every minute we wait, they're moving further ahead." "They're not moving ahead," Elena replied, finally lifting her gaze from the paper. "They're waiting for us. That's their game. They've been 2 steps ahead this entire time, and now they want us to take the bait." Her words landed with weight, but Marco didn't slow down. He stopped at the table, staring at the maps spread across it. Red pins dotted key locations, warehouses, dockyards, and back alleys no one visited unless they had business with the wrong kind of people. "They've been using us to clean up their mess," Elena continued. "Every lead we've chased, every trail we've followed, it's all been part of their plan." Marco's jaw tightened. "So what? We just give up? Let them think they've beaten us?" "I didn't say that," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around the paper. "But we need to change the rules." Before she could explain, a faint knock echoed from the door, a slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 taps. Silence. Then 2 more. Marco's hand instinctively went to the concealed holster at his side. Elena froze, her mind racing through the possibilities. They exchanged a look, both knowing without saying it that whoever was on the other side wasn't there by accident. Marco gestured for her to stay back as he approached the door. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he pressed his ear against the wood. A low voice came through. "It's me. I don't have much time." Marco's eyes narrowed. The voice was familiar but strained, as if the speaker was injured or trying to keep from being overheard. He unlatched the door just enough to peek through. Standing there was Rafi, the informant they thought had disappeared weeks ago, the one everyone believed had either skipped town or been silenced for good. "Let me in," Rafi said urgently, glancing over his shoulder into the shadows. "They're watching the street." Once inside, Rafi wasted no time. He dropped a crumpled envelope onto the table, its contents spilling out: photographs, copies of shipping manifests, and a single small flash drive. "This is everything," Rafi said, his voice rough. "But you need to understand something. They're not just after you. They're after anyone connected to the old network. And they're moving fast." Elena's heart pounded as she sifted through the photographs. One image stopped her cold. It showed a warehouse she recognized, but the faces in the background weren't strangers. They were people she'd trusted for years. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "Why would they?" "Because they've been working both sides," Rafi cut in. "They're not loyal to anyone except the highest bidder. And right now, the highest bidder wants you gone." Marco stared at him. Who's pulling the strings? Rafi hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. If I say the name, you won't believe me. But you'll see soon enough. They're making their move tonight. Before either of them could press for more, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the tense quiet. Marco moved to the window, his pulse spiking. A black SUV had pulled up across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the dim streetlights. "They're here," Rafi said grimly. "And they're not coming to talk." The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Marco grabbed the map and swept the photographs back into the envelope. Elena stuffed the flash drive into her jacket pocket. Rafi moved toward the back exit, but stopped. "If you want to survive this, you need to get to the docks before midnight. There's something that they can't afford for you to find. But once you see it, there's no going back." The roar of car doors slamming shut jolted them into motion. Footsteps approached fast, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Marco signaled for everyone to move, and they slipped through the narrow hallway toward the rear door. But just before they could step outside, the glass of the front window shattered, a metal canister rolling across the floor and hissing out thick smoke. Coughing and squinting against the sting in their eyes, they stumbled into the alley. The night air was sharp, but it carried another sound, a faint, steady beeping coming from somewhere nearby. Elena's eyes widened as realization hit. They're not here to capture us. They're here to trap us. Somewhere in the darkness, a second SUV engine roared to life, blocking the far end of the alley. The only way forward was toward the docks, but even as they ran, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly where their enemies wanted them to go. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what waited for them at the water's edge, a truth that could blow everything wide open or destroy them before they ever had the chance to speak it aloud. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with an invisible weight. Outside, the city's hum seemed distant, almost muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air between them was thick with the kind of silence that comes before something unthinkable. Every glance carried unspoken questions. Every heartbeat echoed too loudly in their ears. They all knew they had reached a point where retreat was no longer an option. Whatever was coming next would decide everything. The faint buzz of the phone broke the quiet. It wasn't loud, but in that moment, it felt like a gunshot. One of them reached for it hesitantly, eyes scanning the others as if asking for permission. The screen showed an unknown number. Normally, they'd ignore it, but tonight, nothing was normal. The call was answered on speaker. A voice came through, low and unhurried, with a strange calm that only made it more unsettling. It spoke in fragments, almost like riddles, but each word carried the weight of certainty. Whoever was knew too much. They didn't threaten outright, yet the implication was clear. They were being watched, and their every move was already anticipated. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. They tried to respond, to ask who was speaking, but the line went dead. A hollow click was all that remained, leaving them in a silence far more dangerous than before. It wasn't just about what the voice had said. It was about what it hadn't. Someone had just shifted the game, and they were no longer sure who the real enemy was. Then came a sound, soft at first, like something brushing against glass. It drew all their eyes toward the window. Shadows moved outside, but they weren't the usual shapes of pedestrians or passing cars. These were slower, more deliberate, as if whoever was out there wanted them to know they were being observed. No one dared move closer, but their instincts screamed that they were boxed in. A decision had to be made. They could stay here and wait for whatever was coming, or they could make a move before it was too late. But the danger wasn't only outside. The second twist revealed itself in the smallest of ways. One of their own, someone they had trusted without question, wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. At first, it seemed like fear. Then, a detail clicked. Something they had said earlier didn't line up with the timeline everyone else remembered. The realization crept in slowly, chillingly. If the voice on the phone had been one threat, this was another entirely. The shadows outside were dangerous, but the betrayal inside could destroy them faster. And the worst part was, they couldn't accuse anyone without proof. The wrong move could fracture what little trust remained. A quiet plan began forming. Split up without making it obvious, find the weak link, and control the situation before it spiraled beyond repair. But that was easier said than done. Every sound now seemed amplified. The creak of the floor, the distant wail of a siren, the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Time was slipping away, and the stakes had never been higher. Somewhere outside, a car engine started, its low rumble sending a fresh wave of unease through the room. Whoever had been in the shadows wasn't just watching, they were repositioning. The thought made every hair stand on end. If the enemy was closing in from both outside and within, then the next move had to be bold, precise, and immediate. And yet, in the middle of all this tension, there was a strange, undeniable truth. They had never been closer to uncovering the real reason all of this had started. The second twist wasn't just about betrayal. It was about a hidden connection that none of them had seen until now, a thread tying them all to something much bigger, much older, and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The only question now was who would act first, and whether that action would save them or destroy them completely. The room felt heavier than before, every word carrying more weight than anyone dared to acknowledge. The clock on the wall ticked louder, as if mocking the tension. Eyes shifted from one person to another, searching for answers, or maybe for someone brave enough to voice what everyone was thinking. But no one spoke. It wasn't just fear holding their tongues. It was the knowledge that whatever came next would change everything. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass windows like impatient fingers tapping for attention. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine revved, then cut off abruptly. It wasn't unusual, but in that moment, every sound felt suspicious. No one was sure if danger was outside, waiting to pounce, or already sitting among them. Then, without warning, the front door creaked open. The sound was so faint it might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But now, it echoed like a gunshot. Everyone froze, their bodies stiffening as they turned toward the noise. A shadow appeared in the doorway, tall, slow-moving, and deliberate. It was a man they all recognized, yet his presence here made no sense. He was supposed to be somewhere else, far away from this mess. His eyes scanned the room, and though his lips curved into a faint smile, there was nothing warm about it. It was the kind of smile that hid secrets. "Looks like I came at the right time," he said, stepping inside. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and it sent a chill down spines. Nobody moved to greet him. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. Why was he here? Who had told him? And more importantly, what did he know? He walked to the center of the room, the sound of his shoes on the floorboards loud and steady. Then he stopped and set a small black envelope on the table. It was sealed with red wax, the kind people used when they wanted to make sure nothing inside could be tampered with. "This," he said, tapping the envelope lightly, "is the missing piece you've all been chasing." The statement landed like a stone in water, rippling through the room, sending silent shockwaves. Nobody reached for it right away. They knew better than to grab something like that without thinking. Whatever was inside would either save them or destroy them. Finally, one person stepped forward, but before they could touch it, the man's hand shot out. "Not so fast. You'll hear the story first." He pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning back with a composure that felt almost staged. "You think you know who's been pulling the strings," he said slowly, "but you've been looking in the wrong direction the whole time." Murmurs broke out, but he raised his hand to silence them. This isn't about loyalty or betrayal. It's about survival. And the truth is, someone in this room has already chosen a side. Just not the side you think. Every face tensed. The thought that one of them had already made a silent deal with the enemy shifted the entire mood. The room was no longer a group trying to solve a mystery. It was a group quietly wondering who among them had already sold them out. Before anyone could question him further, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and the look on his face changed. Not fear exactly, but a grim acknowledgement. He slid the phone back into his pocket without answering it. "We don't have much time," he said. "Once I open this envelope, everything changes. There's no going back, and the person responsible, he let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging like a dark cloud over the room. The wind outside howled harder, as if nature itself was warning them. Somewhere down the hallway, a faint creak suggested movement, though no one had left their seat. It was then that the lights flickered, just once, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of tension through the group. The man leaned forward, placing both elbows on the table. "I hope you're all ready," he said softly, "because the second you hear what's inside this, your world will be divided in two, before and after." No one dared to breathe too loudly. Every ear strained for the sound of the seal breaking, but he didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked around the table, locking eyes with each person as if daring them to admit their guilt before the truth spilled out. Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. More than one pair. Slow, deliberate, approaching. And that was when they realized the real danger might already be here. Rain began to fall harder, the sound echoing off the narrow alleyways like a warning drumbeat. Every step the crew took toward the old warehouse seemed heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on them. Inside, the faint hum of machinery mixed with the smell of oil and damp metal. They knew someone was already here. The plan they had been working on for weeks was suddenly at risk, but walking away wasn't an option, not after everything they had lost to get this far. Luca moved first, slipping between stacks of crates, his hand brushing over the cold steel of the pistol he kept hidden. He wasn't planning to draw it yet, but knowing it was there made him feel a little less exposed. Behind him, Elena's eyes kept darting to the shadows above, the rusted catwalks where someone could be watching. She hated that the place was so quiet. Too quiet. In their world, silence was never a sign of safety. They stopped near the center of the warehouse, where a single light bulb swung lazily, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The rain outside pounded harder, masking the faint shuffle of feet until it was too late. Figures stepped out from behind the crates, 3 men, each armed, faces hidden beneath dark hoods. The leader stepped forward, his boots leaving small splashes in the puddles on the concrete floor. "You're early," he said, his voice low, carrying the kind of calm that came from knowing he had the upper hand. Elena tensed, realizing immediately this wasn't part of the deal. Whoever these men were, they weren't supposed to be here. Luca tried to read their faces, but the shadows kept them hidden. The man's tone shifted, less casual now. "You've been making moves, stirring the wrong waters. Someone wants you gone before you finish what you started." In the back, Marco clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the metal walls. The leader didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, and another sound filled the warehouse, the heavy clank of the main doors sliding shut, locking them inside. Luca's mind raced. If they couldn't get out, then whatever was about to happen would happen here on this cold, wet floor. But then something unexpected broke through the tension, a faint buzz in Elena's pocket. She pulled out her phone, glancing down for only a second. Her face paled. It was a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Don't trust the one standing beside you." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She looked up slowly, scanning the faces around her, her thoughts spiraling. Beside her, did that mean Luca? Or Marco? Or was the message meant for all of them? If the sender was inside the warehouse, then they knew exactly where she was standing. And if they knew that, they had been watching for a long time. Before she could say anything, the leader of the hooded men took a step closer. "Time's up," he said. His hand moved toward his jacket, but before he could pull anything out, another sound ripped through the space. A gunshot, but not from any of them. From above, one of the hooded men dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the floor. The light bulb above swung faster now, as if the air itself was unsettled. Everyone ducked for cover. Luca dragged Elena behind a crate, whispering sharply, "This isn't them. There's someone else here." Another shot rang out, and the second man fell. The leader cursed under his breath, scanning the catwalks, but the shooter remained hidden. The rain's rhythm outside matched the pounding in Elena's chest as she gripped the message in her mind. The tension spiraled higher when the shooter's voice echoed from above, distorted by the metal. "The deal's changed." Leave the package and walk away. Luca's eyes widened. That voice, it was familiar, but he couldn't place it under the echo. The leader of the hooded men snarled, clearly unwilling to give in, and the standoff stretched tight like a wire about to snap. From their hiding spot, Elena whispered, "If they're after the package, then they know what's in it." That means, she stopped herself. Saying it aloud felt like giving it away. But Luca's eyes said he was already thinking the same thing. The sound of boots on the catwalk grew closer, the shooter moving fast now. Shadows twisted above, merging and breaking apart with every flicker of the swinging light. The leader of the hooded men barked an order, and suddenly the air filled with the metallic clatter of more men entering from the far side of the warehouse. They were surrounded again, but this time they didn't even know who was on which side. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but with the doors locked and every exit covered, there was nowhere to go. The shooter from above jumped down, landing with a thud that echoed like a warning shot. When they stepped into the light, Elena's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't an enemy. It was someone they thought had been gone for good, someone they had mourned. And yet, here they were, standing between them and the hooded men, guns still raised. But the shock didn't end there, because the first thing this person said was, "I'm not here for you. I'm here for the traitor." The night air felt heavy, almost electric, as if the city itself knew something was about to happen. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder. The tension that had been building for days now clung to everyone's movements, like an invisible weight no one could shake off. The docks were quieter than usual, the water's surface reflecting the dim yellow lights in long, trembling streaks. It was here that all the threads finally came together, where months of suspicion, betrayal, and hidden truths would either collapse or explode. Marco stood with his back to the water, his coat swaying lightly in the breeze. He had been the center of this storm from the start, though no one fully realized just how deep his role went. Across from him, Elena moved slowly forward, each step deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. She had pieced together enough to know he wasn't just a pawn in this game. He was one of the architects. Yet something in his face told her there was still more, something neither she nor anyone else had expected. The rumble of an approaching car broke the stillness. Tires crunched against gravel before the vehicle stopped just out of the light. The door opened, and to everyone's shock, it wasn't any of Marco's men. It was Detective Ramos. His sudden appearance felt like a collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. Ramos stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his hand stayed near the inside of his jacket, where his weapon rested. "You told me you wanted to make this right," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her. "But all this time you were feeding both sides." Marco gave a slow, almost sorrowful smile. "Sometimes the only way to survive is to play every side. But you wouldn't understand, Elena, you still think there's a line between right and wrong in this city." Ramos stepped between them slightly, looking at Marco with cold focus. "She's not wrong. You've been orchestrating moves that got people hurt. But here's the part she doesn't know. You weren't doing it alone." The words cut through the air like a blade. Elena frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Marco's smile faded, replaced by something harder. "Go ahead, detective. Tell her." Ramos took a deep breath, his voice low. The one pulling the strings from the start wasn't Marco. It was someone higher, someone we all trusted. And they're here tonight. From the shadows near the warehouse, a figure emerged. At first, Elena thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But as the light caught the man's face, her heart stopped. It was her brother, Daniel, the one who had disappeared years ago, presumed dead in a deal gone wrong. His presence was like a ghost stepping out of a nightmare. "Elena," Daniel said softly, his tone almost pleading, "it's not what you think." But Elena could barely breathe. "You were behind this." "I was behind stopping it," Daniel replied. "But to do that, I had to become part of it. Every choice I made was to protect you, even if it meant looking like the enemy." Marco glanced between them, his jaw tightening. "Protect her? You nearly burned the city to the ground." Daniel shook his head. "No, I was trying to keep it from collapsing completely. If I hadn't stepped in, the people you answer to, Marco, would have destroyed everything, including her. The wind off the water picked up, carrying the smell of salt and gasoline. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn echoed, but here, the silence felt suffocating. Elena's mind spun. Everything she thought she knew about the last few years had been ripped apart in seconds. She looked from her brother to Marco to Ramos, realizing that no matter who claimed to be in the right, all of them had blood on their hands in one way or another. Suddenly, the faint click of a safety being released cut through the night. Everyone froze. A shadow moved on the far end of the dock, a sniper, hidden until now, his scope glinting under the light. He wasn't aiming at Marco or Daniel. His target was Elena. Before anyone could react, Daniel lunged, knocking Elena to the ground just as the shot rang out. The bullet struck the wooden crate behind where she'd been standing, splintering it into sharp shards. Ramos drew his weapon and returned fire toward the darkness, while Marco shouted something in a language Elena didn't recognize. The air erupted into chaos, boots pounding against the dock, more gunfire cracking through the night. Daniel helped her up, his grip firm. "You have to leave now. There's more coming." But Elena shook her head, tears mixing with anger in her eyes. "Not until you tell me the truth. All of it." Daniel hesitated for just a second too long. That was when another figure appeared from behind the warehouse, someone Elena recognized instantly. It was Sophia, her closest friend, the one person she had trusted completely through all of this. And in her hand was a gun, aimed squarely at Daniel. "You weren't supposed to survive tonight," Sophia said, her voice cold. "None of you were." Elena's chest tightened. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the final twist that made everything crumble. Sophia had been there from the beginning, comforting her, guiding her, pretending to help. But she had been the last player in the game all along. And now, in the echo of the gunfire and the crashing waves, Elena realized that the real danger had been standing right beside her the entire time. The rain had started again, light at first, then steady, drumming against the windows like a warning no one wanted to hear. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of oil, damp wood, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Marco's breathing was uneven, his shirt sticking to his back as he stared at the figures in front of him. He had spent weeks chasing answers, pulling at threads that led him deeper into the city's underbelly. But now, every tangled piece of the puzzle stood in one room, and the truth felt heavier than any secret he'd imagined. Rico leaned casually against a crate, his smirk hiding something darker. "You thought you were the only one looking for her?" he asked, voice low, almost amused. "You've been dancing in the middle of a storm you don't understand." His words weren't a threat, they were a reminder. Marco felt the weight of them sink in as his eyes flicked toward the far corner, where Elena sat, her wrists bound, her gaze steady despite the situation. She wasn't afraid. She looked almost resigned. "I found the ledgers," Marco said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I know where the shipments are going. I know who's paying for them." He took a slow step forward, watching Rico's reaction. "And I know you've been playing both sides." Rico chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That's the thing about sides, Marco. They don't matter when you own the board." His hand moved slightly, and two men stepped forward from the shadows, both armed, both with the cold precision of people who'd done this before. Marco felt his chest tighten. This was it, the moment everything balanced on. But before he could speak, Elena's voice cut through the tension. "You don't understand," she said, her tone calm but urgent. "You think this is about smuggling? About money? Rico's not the one in charge here." The room stilled. Even Rico turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Elena," he said softly. She ignored him, looking straight at Marco. "The person funding all of this, the one pulling the strings, is someone you trust, someone you've been reporting to." Her words landed like a blow, and Marco felt the ground tilt beneath him. His mind raced through names, faces, conversations. And then it hit him. The late-night calls, the missing files, the way certain leads had vanished before he could follow them. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. It can't be. The door at the far end of the warehouse creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed against the concrete. The figure that emerged from the shadows made Marco's breath catch. Detective Harris, his mentor, the man who had brought him into the force, the one person he believed would never betray him. Harris stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Marco," he said, his tone measured, "you were supposed to walk away from this weeks ago. You had your warnings, but you kept digging." His eyes moved briefly to Elena, then back to Marco. "Now you've left me no choice." Rico shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "We had a deal," he said sharply. "You still do," Harris replied coolly. "But Marco's not part of it anymore." The betrayal stung deeper than any physical wound. Marco could hear his heartbeat in his ears, could feel the years of trust unraveling with each word Harris spoke. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely more than a rasp. Harris sighed, as if the question was naive. "Because loyalty doesn't pay the bills, Marco. Influence does. And sometimes, to keep the city running, you have to make alliances people wouldn't understand." For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then, without warning, Elena moved. She kicked the crate beside her, sending it toppling into one of Rico's men, and in the chaos that followed, the warehouse erupted into motion. Marco dove for cover, grabbing the pistol from the ground, the sound of gunfire tearing through the room. When the noise finally faded, Rico was gone. Harris was wounded, but conscious, and Elena stood over him, breathing hard. She looked at Marco, her eyes sharp. "This isn't over," she said. "He's not the top either. There's still someone above him." The finality of her words hit harder than the gunfire. Even with Harris exposed, the real mastermind was still out there. And now Marco knew. His fight was just beginning. The streets felt calmer now, almost too calm, as if the city itself had let out a long breath after holding it in for far too long. The dust from the final confrontation had settled, and the echoes of shouting and footsteps had faded into memory. People who had been afraid to step outside were beginning to reappear, peeking out from doorways, their cautious eyes slowly softening into relief. It wasn't just that the danger was over. It was that the truth had finally surfaced, cutting through the lies that had kept everyone trapped in fear. The weight on everyone's shoulders had lifted, even if the scars of the past would remain. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered in the old cafe on the corner, the same one where so much of this story had begun. It was strange to sit at those wooden tables again, hearing the sound of coffee cups clinking, but now with a different kind of tension in the air. Less about fear of what might happen, more about processing what had already passed. Faces were tired, but hopeful. Conversations quieter than usual, as if each person was trying to piece together their own understanding of what had happened. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just a quiet acknowledgement that life would move forward from here, step by step. The key players in the fight for the truth sat together, not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as people bound by something far stronger. They had all been changed in ways they couldn't fully explain. Some had lost friends, others had lost trust in systems they once believed in, and a few had lost everything except their will to keep going. But sitting there, sharing the same table, they knew they had gained something too: clarity, courage, and a kind of unspoken loyalty to each other that didn't need to be put into words. In the days that followed, the rumors faded and the facts took their place. The false narratives that had spread so quickly were replaced by documented truth, and those who had hidden in shadows could no longer escape the light. Investigations began, not as a show for the public, but with genuine intent to hold the right people accountable. It wouldn't be an instant fix. Real change rarely is, but the first cracks in the old walls of corruption had formed, and there was no going back. The city began to heal in small but noticeable ways. Streets that had been silent at night now had the faint sound of laughter again. Businesses reopened their doors. People walked without constantly glancing over their shoulders, and families who had been divided by fear started reconnecting. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And in a place where progress had once felt impossible, that was enough for now. For those who had been at the center of the storm, letting go wasn't easy. The memories of close calls, of whispered plans in the dark, of the constant tension of not knowing who could be trusted, they didn't vanish just because the danger was over. But they learned to carry those memories differently, not as heavy chains, but as reminders of why they had fought in the first place. Each one of them understood that the victory wasn't just about winning against those who had done wrong. It was about proving to themselves that they could stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, the group met one last time. There was no agenda, no reason other than to share a final moment before life inevitably pulled them in different directions. They talked about small things, the weather, the food, the way the light caught the tops of the buildings. But under all of that was the unspoken understanding that this was the closing of a chapter. When they finally stood up and walked away from that table, they knew that while the battle had ended, the story would live on in the way they carried themselves from that day forward. In the weeks after, people would still stop them on the street, offering quiet thanks or simply nodding in recognition. They weren't looking for praise. They had never been in it for that. But knowing that others had been inspired to speak up, to push back when something felt wrong, was the real reward. It was proof that what they had done mattered, that the risk had been worth it. But just when it seemed the last loose end had been tied, an unexpected letter arrived. No name, no return address, just a single sheet of paper with a few carefully chosen words. It spoke of something unfinished, a thread left dangling in the shadows. It hinted that the events they had lived through were only a small part of a much larger picture, one that stretched far beyond the borders of their city. There was no threat, no urgency, only the quiet suggestion that one day they might have to face something even bigger than what they had already survived. Most would have brushed it off as nothing, but they knew better. They understood that the world didn't work in neat endings, that behind every truth uncovered there was another waiting to be found. And though they hoped for peace, a part of them stayed ready, because once you've seen what hides in the dark, you never stop keeping an eye on the shadows. In the end, life returned to its steady rhythm, but it was a different rhythm than before, one that moved with purpose. The people had learned that change wasn't just about removing the bad, but about choosing to build something better in its place. And for those who had fought for it, there was a quiet pride in knowing they had been part of that change, that they had stood when it mattered most. The city would remember their names, but more importantly, it would remember the lesson. Even in the face of fear, truth has a way of finding its voice, and when enough people choose to listen, it can't be silenced. And as long as there were people willing to carry that truth forward, the story wasn't really over. It was simply turning the page to whatever came next.